Before we dive into this spine-chilling story, please subscribe now for daily tales you won't want to miss. It was almost 10 when my phone rang. I was sprawled on the couch, half asleep, still wearing my work boots from a long day of patching leaks and wrestling stubborn pipes. When the screen lit up with an unknown number, I considered ignoring it. No one calls a plumber this late unless it's a real mess, like sewage flooding a basement or a toilet that decided to explode. Still, rent was due soon, and late calls usually meant desperation, which always meant a fat paycheck. I sighed, grabbed the phone, and answered. "Alex here," I said. The voice on the other end was calm, too calm for someone calling a plumber at this hour. "Good evening. Is this the plumber, Mr. Alex?" There was something off about the way he spoke, like someone trying to sound polite but landing somewhere strange instead. I sat up straighter. "Yeah, that's me. Who's this?" "My name is Darrow. I apologize for the hour, but I need you to come tonight. The pipes in my house are making noises." I rubbed my eyes and leaned back, waiting for the usual explanation, water hammering, bad valves, rattling pipes. Instead, Mr. Darrow's voice dropped slightly, just enough to make my skin prickle. Knocks. Dragging sounds. A pause. Something's moving. His tone was flat, like he was reading from a script. No panic, no frustration, just facts. I frowned. "Dragging? You mean like an air bubble? Or..." "No," he cut in. "Not air, not water, just sounds. You'll understand when you hear them." I glanced at the clock. 10:04. "Sir, I can come in the morning, if it's not a burst pipe or flooding." And then he said, "I'll pay double." That shut me up for a second. Double was rare. Double at this time of night was unheard of. Double usually came with a smell I'd regret later, but Darrow didn't sound like a guy dealing with anything so simple. "Why don't you call someone closer to you?" I asked. The last one never finished the job. My hand froze on my knee. "What do you mean he never finished?" Another pause, a faint crackle on the line like static. Then, just as calm as before, Mr. Darrow replied, "He left." I hesitated, chewing on the inside of my cheek. "How far are you?" "The house is a bit removed. The drive will take you an hour." I exhaled sharply. An hour. I almost said no right then and there. But double pay was too good to pass up, and work had been slow lately. Besides, I was curious now. Curious and uneasy. Those two feelings rarely mix well. "Fine. Text me the address," I said, already regretting it. "Thank you, Mr. Alex. I'll see you soon." The line went dead. I stared at my phone for a second before standing up and dragging my tool bag from the hallway closet. As I loaded the bag into the truck, I muttered to myself, "Who the hell calls a plumber at 10 p.m.? The night air was sharp and quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you notice every sound. Gravel crunching under my boots, the dull thud of the toolbox hitting the truck bed. I climbed in, slammed the door shut, and checked the address Darrow had sent. It was far. The map showed a jagged line of back roads leading to a pin that seemed to hover in the middle of nowhere. I frowned, suddenly aware of how empty the road ahead felt. The pay was good, though. Too good. I turned the key in the ignition, and my truck rumbled to life. As I pulled out onto the dark road, one thought settled in the back of my mind like a splinter I couldn't shake. Why didn't the last guy finish the job? I pulled up to the house, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The place sat far off from the nearest road, almost isolated. The driveway was cracked and uneven, weeds growing through the gaps. The house itself was massive, old, like it hadn't seen a repair in decades. The windows were dark, no lights on inside. Mr. Darrow opened the door just as I reached the porch. He had a calm, polite smile, though it didn't quite match the situation. His voice was steady as he spoke, and I followed him inside. "Glad you could make it," he said, stepping aside. I hadn't even taken a full step before I saw the rest of the family. Mrs. Darrow was sitting on a wooden chair by the staircase, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She gave me a faint, polite smile as she watched me, her eyes distant. In the corner, their son sat on the floor, not playing, just staring. His focus was on something in his hands, but he didn't look up as I passed. "The pipes are old," Mr. Darrow said, his voice still calm as we moved down the hall. "They make odd noises. You'll fix it, won't you?" I nodded without thinking much about it, glancing at the family again. Mrs. Darrow's smile never wavered, but there was something about her gaze that felt a little off. "Where's the main valve?" I asked, trying to focus on the job. Downstairs, in the back, Mr. Darrow replied, gesturing toward the basement. I made my way down the hall, the soft thud of my boots on the old floorboards the only sound in the house. The family didn't say anything more as I passed. They just watched, quietly. I started by checking the kitchen sink, turning the tap to see what was coming out. The water flowed, but it wasn't clear. It ran cold and murky, like it had been stuck in the pipes for a while. I let it run for a minute, but it didn't improve. Well, that's not good, I muttered as I crouched down, pulling open the cupboard under the sink. The pipes looked old. You could tell they'd been in place for decades without a second thought. I grabbed my wrench and began to inspect the connections, tightening the joints where I could. Mr. Darrow was standing right there, just watching me. It wasn't exactly the most comfortable situation, but I figured he was just interested in getting the issue fixed. I took a quick look at a few of the old tools scattered around under the sink. They were rusty, scratched up, and looked like they hadn't seen use in years. "Did the last plumber leave these behind?" I asked, half joking. He didn't answer right away, just nodded slightly, his eyes still fixed on me. I focused back on the pipes, trying to make sense of the water situation. The more I worked, the more I realized it wasn't just the murky water that was the problem. The pressure was low, and the flow was inconsistent. As I adjusted a valve, I heard a faint noise from deep inside the pipes. It almost sounded like something moving around in there, but it was so soft I wasn't sure if I was imagining it. I shook my head, chalking it up to the old pipes. "Probably just air pockets or something," I muttered. "Maybe," Mr. Darrow replied without much emotion, watching closely as I continued working. I shifted to the next sink, checking the connections there. The noise came again, a faint thudding from the pipes, but it still didn't seem like anything I needed to worry about. "Sounds like you've got something alive in there," I said, glancing at Mr. Darrow with a grin. He didn't laugh, just nodded, his face still unreadable. "Any other areas I should check?" I asked, glancing up at him. Mr. Darrow gave a small nod. "The basement. The main valve is down there." "All right, I'll take a look," I said, standing up from under the sink. I grabbed my toolbox and headed toward the stairs, trying to ignore the feeling that the work was taking longer than it should have. The basement was a cramped, dusty space. The air was thick with humidity, carrying the faint smell of mildew. The light flickered when I flipped the switch, almost like the house didn't want to give in to the electricity. I could see old boxes and furniture stacked in the corners, covered in layers of dust like they hadn't been touched in decades. I made my way to the valve, careful not to trip over the clutter. It was tucked in the back behind some shelves, buried under a pile of forgotten junk. I crouched down, grabbed my wrench, and started inspecting the pipes. The valve was caked in grime, old rust clinging to it. I grabbed a rag and wiped it off, but when I looked closer, I saw something strange. Right under all the dirt, there was a handprint-shaped stain. It looked darker than the rest of the grime, like someone had pressed their hand there recently. I rubbed at it, but it wouldn't come off. I frowned. Weird. I tossed the rag aside and got back to work. "Probably just something from before," I muttered, trying to shake the feeling that something was off. As I tightened the valve, I felt a slight vibration in the pipes. At first, I thought it was just the usual creaks and groans of old plumbing, but then I heard it. A faint thudding noise, like something dragging through the pipes. It was soft at first, almost easy to ignore, but as I worked, it seemed to get louder, closer. I stopped, wrench in hand, listening. The noise was definitely there now, a steady rhythm. My stomach tightened. I looked around the basement, but everything was still. I shook my head, trying to stay focused. Old pipes. Probably rats, I said to myself, trying to brush it off. But the sound kept growing. I stood up, wiped my hands on my pants, and glanced around the room. There was no one here, just the same old basement full of forgotten things. But that noise, it didn't stop. It was like something was moving through the pipes, getting closer. It wasn't rats, I was sure of that. I grabbed my tools and moved to the other side of the basement, ignoring the creeping feeling that something was wrong. The noise was still there, just faint enough to make me second-guess what I was hearing. I had to finish this job, no matter how strange it all felt. I took a break and headed up the stairs. my mind still on the pipes and that odd sound I couldn't shake. The house felt cold in a way that didn't make sense for a place with heating. I walked past the narrow hallway and into the kitchen. The Darrows were sitting at the table, but they weren't eating. They were just sitting there, staring at me, almost like they were waiting for me to notice. The boy, Ethan, I think his name was, wasn't even looking at me. His eyes were fixed on the tools I'd left by the door, watching them like he was trying to figure out what they'd do next. It made my skin crawl just a little. Mrs. Darrow finally broke the silence. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're making progress, I hope?" Her voice was flat, too calm. I nodded, trying to ignore the unease creeping up my neck. "Yeah, getting there," I said, leaning against the counter. But there was something off about the way they were all just sitting there, not speaking, not moving. It was like they were frozen in time, waiting for something. I glanced at the table. The plates in front of them were empty. No food, not a single scrap. But the utensils, forks, knives, spoons, were scraping faintly against the china. It wasn't loud, just this soft, hollow sound that seemed to hang in the air. No one was eating, but the noise was there, like they were miming a meal. I cleared my throat and tried to push the weird feeling aside. "Did the last guy leave tools down there?" I asked, trying to make conversation to break the silence. Mrs. Darrow's smile didn't change. "He left many things," she said, her voice like it was rehearsed. I swallowed, suddenly aware that I hadn't seen much of the guy who'd been here before me. No pictures of him, no mention of him beyond the odd comment Mr. Darrow made earlier. It all felt wrong, but I couldn't place why. I shifted uncomfortably, my gaze flickering to the boy again. He hadn't moved, not once, just staring at the tools like they held all the answers. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but the atmosphere in the room was thick, like they were testing me somehow. "I'll get back to it," I said, backing out of the kitchen, not really wanting to stay another second. The silence followed me all the way back down the hall, and I could feel their eyes on my back, even as I turned to go back to the basement. I was focused on tightening the valve, my hands moving quickly to get things back in order. The pipes had been a headache all night, but this felt like the last step. I needed to finish it. Then, the sound changed. It wasn't the usual groaning from old pipes anymore. It turned into something deeper, something heavier. There was a dragging noise, like something was moving through the pipes, scraping and thudding with each step. It was so loud now, almost too close, and I could feel the vibration in the walls. I paused, wrench in hand, listening. The noise wasn't just a random groan. It was deliberate, like it was being dragged along the pipes, making its way toward me. I shook my head, trying to push it out of my mind. I had a job to do. Tighten the valve, fix the leak. It wasn't anything I hadn't handled before. But the sound didn't stop. It was getting louder, closer, the thudding almost like footsteps moving through the walls. I started working faster, tightening the valve as quickly as I could, but my mind was racing. Whatever was in those pipes, it wasn't normal. Then I felt it. A drop of water hit the back of my neck. I jerked, wiping it away with the back of my hand. It was warm, like it had been sitting there for a while. I glanced up at the ceiling. Nothing. But the warmth lingered on my skin, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The dragging noise picked up again, louder and more forceful. I looked down at the floor, trying to stay focused on the valve, but I couldn't help but feel that the space around me was growing tighter. The walls seemed to shift, almost like they were closing in. I glanced over at the pipes, still vibrating with each movement. The noise from the pipes had changed again. It wasn't just dragging anymore. It was thumping, like something heavy was crawling its way toward me. I gripped the wrench harder, trying to ignore the discomfort, the feeling of being watched. I couldn't stop now. Then I heard it, a faint whisper. It came from somewhere in the pipes, barely audible, like a murmur just beyond my reach. I tensed, but I couldn't make out any words. It was unsettling, but I forced myself to focus on the task at hand. I bent down to grab my tools, but my hand slipped. The wrench hit the floor with a loud clatter, echoing in the silence of the basement. I froze, staring at the scattered tools. My fingers were numb. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, but something felt different now. It wasn't just the pipes. There was something else down here. I knelt down by the valve, wrench in hand, trying to get a better grip, but it wouldn't budge. The leak was growing faster, water creeping across the floor and pooling around my feet. The sound of it splashing echoed in the otherwise silent basement. I gritted my teeth and twisted harder, but nothing changed. The water kept rising, now reaching my ankles. It was cold, and the pressure of it against my legs added to the frustration. I was running out of time. The pipes groaned again, and this time I felt the vibrations through my fingers where they were pressed against the valve. I stopped for a second, glancing around, but I couldn't tell where the noise was coming from. There wasn't much light, and what little there was flickered nervously. I tried again, tightening the valve, and this time I heard something else, like a scraping sound coming from deep inside the pipes. My heart skipped. It was a slow, deliberate drag, not like a rat or debris stuck in the system. It was too heavy, too purposeful. I stood up, wiped my hands on my pants, and glanced around the basement. The water was rising faster now, creeping toward my knees. My boots were soaked, and the cold was creeping in. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. I couldn't get the valve to seal, and the water kept rising. It shouldn't have been this bad. I tried to shake off the growing unease. The house was old. The pipes were ancient. It was just a plumbing problem, nothing more. But the more I thought about it, the more everything felt wrong. The scraping sound came again, this time louder, closer. It rattled through the pipes, like something was inching its way toward me. I froze, listening hard, but it was hard to tell if it was real or just the echo of the house settling. I turned back to the valve, desperate to get it fixed. But it was useless. The water kept rising, and I could feel the pressure building. I had to get out of here. The house wasn't just falling apart, it was breaking down faster than I could keep up. I rushed up the stairs, my boots splashing through the rising water. I needed help, but I didn't know where to turn. The basement had become a mess, and I was in over my head. The hallway at the top of the stairs was quiet, too quiet. I couldn't hear anything except the faint sound of metal scraping against plates, like someone was setting the table in the distance. When I reached the living room, it was empty. No one was there. Then I saw them. The family was standing at the far end of the hallway, perfectly still. Mr. Darrow, Mrs. Darrow, and the boy, all watching me intently. There was no movement, no sound, just their eyes fixed on me. "Is it fixed?" Mr. Darrow asked in that same calm tone, as though nothing out of the ordinary was happening. I couldn't hold back anymore. "What's down there? What happened to the last guy?" Mr. Darrow didn't seem fazed. "Nothing. We don't know. He left." His eyes didn't shift, his voice never wavered. "Your pipes are shot. We need to shut off the main line. This isn't something I can fix right now." Mrs. Darrow's faint smile remained, almost as if she didn't hear the urgency in my voice. "You'll finish, won't you?" I stared at her, confused and frustrated. Something was off. This wasn't how people reacted to a plumbing disaster. I wanted to scream at them, to demand they help me, but I couldn't find the words. The boy walked toward me then, slowly, his small feet making no sound. He stopped just in front of me, looked up, and in a voice so calm, he whispered, "They're waiting." He pointed to the basement door. I didn't know what to say. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The family hadn't moved an inch. It was like they were part of the house, as still and silent as the walls themselves. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong here. Something wasn't right with them, or with the house. They didn't seem concerned about the water or the damage. It was like they were waiting for something, or someone. And the more I looked at them, the more I realized that whatever was going on in this house wasn't just a matter of faulty plumbing. It was something far worse. I turned toward the basement door, a knot forming in my stomach. I had to finish this, but I wasn't sure if I was ready to find out what else I was dealing with. The basement was completely dark now, the only sound coming from the pipes groaning under pressure. The water around my ankles had already risen too high for comfort, and I could feel the cold seeping through my soaked boots. I needed to fix the line, but it felt like the house itself was fighting me. Every time I tried to twist the valve, the pipe seemed to resist, like something was pushing back. Then, the noise got louder, a deep, rumbling growl from inside the walls. I could feel the vibration under my feet, and the sound of groaning pipes filled the air, as if something large was crawling through them. I was getting frustrated. My hands were shaking as I worked, trying to tighten the valve, but it wouldn't budge. And then, suddenly, a pipe near me burst open with a loud crack. A cold, slimy force wrapped around my wrist, so tight I could barely move. I gasped, trying to pull my arm free, but the grip was unyielding, dragging me toward the broken pipe. My boots slipped in the rising water, and I stumbled, fighting against the pull. The basement floor was slick, and I could feel my body being dragged inch by inch toward the hole in the wall. Desperately, I reached out with my free hand for something, anything, to stop myself from being pulled in. My fingers closed around the heavy wrench I'd left on the ground, and with all my strength, I swung it toward the main line. The wrench slammed into the valve, and I hit it again and again, trying to force it open. The pipe exploded with a deafening noise. For a split second, everything seemed to freeze. Then the water came, flooding out in a massive surge, dark and foul. The impact knocked me backwards, sending me crashing into the wall as I was drenched in filthy black water. The basement was filling up fast. Water poured through the walls and down the stairs, surging over everything. I could barely breathe as I fought to keep my head above the rising tide. My body was heavy with the weight of the water, and I could feel it pushing against me, pulling me down. I scrambled, trying to get to the stairs. My feet were slipping, my heart pounding as the water rose higher and higher. It felt like the basement was alive, the walls closing in. The water chased me, creeping up my legs, then my waist. I could hear it rushing behind me, like something was coming for me. I didn't have time to think. I pushed myself up the steps, my legs burning with effort. The basement door was only a few steps away, but I could feel the water closing in on me, pulling at my feet. I made it to the top, gasping for air, and slammed the door shut behind me, leaving the flood to fill the basement below. My heart was racing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still coming. I stumbled out the front door, breathless and drenched. My feet were heavy, each step sinking into the soaked lawn as I made my way away from the house. I turned back just for a moment, and what I saw made my stomach lurch. Water poured from every window, flooding the yard, spilling out like the house itself was coughing it up. It looked wrong, shifting, almost like it was alive. And then I saw them, standing at the window. Mr. and Mrs. Darrow, frozen in place, their figures unnaturally still. But their bodies, they shifted. Their skin stretched, their limbs elongated, like something was forcing them to change. The way they stood there, watching, made my blood run cold. The boy wasn't standing anymore. He was crawling up the wall, his head twisted completely around, eyes glowing in the dim light. I didn't know what I was seeing, but it wasn't human. I couldn't look away, paralyzed by the sight. What are you?" I whispered, but the words felt useless. I didn't wait for an answer. I turned and ran, my legs moving on their own, carrying me away as fast as I could. Behind me, the ground trembled, but I kept going, not daring to stop. When I reached the end of the driveway, I looked back. The house was gone. All that was left was a massive black puddle in the yard, reflecting the night sky. In the water, I saw them again, Mr. and Mrs. Darrow, their faces twisted into something monstrous, grinning back at me. The reflection rippled, and just like that, they were gone. The puddle was still, as if nothing had ever happened. I didn't stick around to find out. I ran until I couldn't hear anything but my own heartbeat. After everything that happened, I thought I'd finally left it behind. But every night, when I close my eyes, it's like I'm back there, trapped in that house with the Darrows. I still see their faces, twisted and grinning, and hear their voices, soft and cold. The same unnatural smile, the same whispered words, "You didn't fix it." It's like they're still waiting for me to finish something, like I never really left. No matter how far I go, it feels like they're always just behind me, waiting for that last thing to be done. And I'm starting to wonder if I'll ever escape it. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe for more creepy tales. If you'd like to support the channel, consider buying me a coffee on Ko-Fi. Every bit helps. Links in the description.